Types of experimental methods. Experiment is a general term and can be conducted as per several methods. 1. Trial and error method. In this method, the researcher formulates a hypothesis and tries to test on actual conditions. For example, a finance minister can experiment with a hypothesis that a moderate tax rate structure may entail greater tax compliance. 2. Natural or uncontrolled observation method. This type of experiment is conducted in a natural setting or circumstances. It is also called field observation. In this type of experiment, certain things are done and their effect is studied in the background of natural setting. 3. Controlled observation method. In this method, the observation or study is made under controlled conditions. Controlled experiment may be defined as a procedure for testing cause and effect relationship within a setting that permits maximum control over extraneous variations and allows the experimenter to observe the effect of one variable on another. 4. Ex post facto experiment. In this type of experiment, the researcher selects two groups with equal number of members. One group is under the influence of one factor and the other is under the influence of another but identical factor. The researcher can judge their positions and he can conclude that the difference in this position is due to the difference in the two factors. 5. Laboratory method of experiment. A laboratory experiment may be defined as one in which the investigator creates an artificial situation with the exact conditions he wishes to have and in which he controls some and manipulates other variables. That is, in this method of experimentation, the researcher creates conditions in which he wants to make his study through manipulation of variables. Experimentation can be done effectively only in laboratory conditions. In the modern method of social research, a laboratory is designed for carrying out social research. This is generally known as sociological laboratory. In this type of laboratory, the experiments relating to social problems are processed. In a sociological laboratory, the data are available for those who do research laboratory who train others in the research method. There are also various specialists in the laboratory who cooperate with the research project. Aims of experiments. To study the effect of particular factor on a system, by considering other affecting factors as irrelevant. To test a hypothesis about any phenomenon. To confirm a known law of nature or to suggest a new one. Merits of experiment method. Experiment method enables study of the cause and effect of a particular factor on a system by isolating other factors. It is possible to formulate hypotheses, test them and reach conclusions easily through experiments. It is useful in situations where control of variables is often necessary. Survey leads to confirmation of known law of nature or to suggest a new one. Demerits of experiment method. In social events, many causes are at work, so there is complexity of social events. Hence it is very difficult to study the effect of a single independent variable on a dependent variable. The subject matter of social sciences is so heterogeneous that it is very difficult to apply experimentation method in social sciences. The experiment method will be fruitful only if subject matter under study is controlled. But the subject matter of social sciences is conscious and fluid and it cannot be easily controlled. Since the subject matter of social sciences are fluid and conscious, they cannot be easily observed. For example, thoughts of a man cannot be rightly observed. So experimental method finds it difficult to tackle such situations. Survey versus experiment. Survey method and experiment method both are widely applied in academic as well as social science researches. A comparison between the two reveal following distinctions. Survey method is applied for descriptive research studies while experiments are a part of experimental research studies. For survey methods, large samples are usually required while for experimental studies only small samples are sufficient. Survey methods are concerned with present and at times consider past events. In surveys, variables that exist and have already occurred are selected and observed. Experimental research provides a systematic and logical method by which deliberate manipulations is done in respect of the effect of certain variables. In an experiment, the researcher measures the effects of an experiment which he conducts intentionally. Statistical method. Statistical method is a system of procedures and techniques of analysis applied to quantitative data. It consists of a system of statistical techniques applicable to numerical data. Statistical method is also called analytical study method. Statistical methods are a mechanical process especially designed to facilitate the consideration and the analysis of a large body of quantitative data. The aim of statistical method is to facilitate comparison, study relationships between the two phenomena and to interpret the data for the purpose of analysis. Steps in statistical methods. 1. Collection of material data must be collected in a systematic manner. The data should be reliable, purposeful and adequate. The data can be collected by library method, experiment method, observation method or questionnaire method. 2. Presentation of data after collection. Data should be suitably classified. Classification is the process of arranging data with some purpose. Classified data should be presented in a neat manner with the help of tables, graphs and diagrams. 3. Analysis of data. The presented data should be properly analyzed with the help of statistical tools like averages, measures of dispersion, coefficient of correlation, etc. By analysis, we mean making a study about the data using statistical measures. 4. Interpretation of data. The analysis of data helps to interpret what the data tells. Interpretation is the process of translating data into easily understandable language to common people. Uses of statistical methods. 1. Statistical methods help comparison between present and the past. 2. It is useful to make protection and to make predictions. 3. Relationships can be studied. 4. It helps to form probable inferences. 5. It describes facts through presentation of data. 6. Its approach is quantitative and hence definite and reliable. Historical method. Historical method of research is a study of past records and other information sources with a view to reconstructing the original and development of an institution or a movement or a system and discovering the trends in the past. Historical method depends upon inferences and logical analysis of recorded data and indirect evidences rather than upon direct observation. The objective of historical method is to draw explanations and generalizations from the past trends in order to understand the present and to anticipate the future. It enables us to know our relationship with the past and to plan more intelligently for the flame. Sources of data for historical method. The sources of data for historical research are 1. Eyewitness or a participant in an event. 2. Oral testimony of iders. 4. Relics. These sources provide data of past but may be scattered or discontinuous. Therefore they should be studied with caution. The origin and genuineness of the sources should be examined thoroughly. Their authenticity should also be tested. Steps in historical method. 1. The feasibility of the study should be examined. It must be ensured that the problem selected is amenable to historical analysis. 2. The selected problem should be formulated and by a plan of study should be designed. 3. Sources of data should be located and determined. 4. Genuineness of the sources and the validity of the facts contained in them should be tested. 5. Relevant facts should be collected from the authentic sources and they should be checked. 6. The facts should be arranged into a logical sequence. 7. Adopt induction process. Meaningful interpretations and generalizations should be made. Limitations of historical method. When the past is much remote, it is very difficult to get the facts. It is difficult to test genuineness and authenticity of source in the data available. It is difficult to arrange the data in time order of events. As the record available is not kept in order, the inference drawn may not be full or accurate. Researcher may not succeed in locating all documents. It is difficult to know the real significance of data when they belong to remote past. Precise measurement, verification and replication are not possible. Review questions. 1. Describe various types of research methods. 2. Distinguish between research techniques and research methods. 3. Give a classification of different research methods. 4. What are features of case study? 5. State the problems in the case study. 6. Explain the sources of case study. 7. State the procedure in case study. 8. What are the assumptions in case study method? 9. Briefly explain survey method. 10. What is social survey? 11. What are the objects of social survey method? 12. Compare survey method with experiment method. 13. State steps in statistical method. 14. What are the merits of historical method? Formulate problem literature. Survey hypothesis research design. Report writing analyze data. Collect data. Sample design. Chart 6.1 steps in research process. Chart 6.1 steps in research process. The chart indicates that the research process consists of closely related activities, as shown through item 7. But such activities overlap continuously rather than following a strictly prescribed sequence. At times, the first step determines the nature of the last step to be undertaken. Subsequent procedures have not been taken into account in the early stages. Serious difficulties may arise which may even prevent the completion of the study. One should remember that neither various steps involved in a research process are mutually exclusive, nor they are separate and distinct. They do not necessarily follow each other in. Unit 6. RESEACH process. Before embarking on the details of research methodology and techniques, it seems appropriate to present a brief overview of the research process. Research process consists of series actions or steps necessary to effectively carry out research. The chart shown in Figure 6.1 illustrates research process. Any specific order and the researcher has to be constantly anticipating at each step in the research process the requirements of the subsequent steps. However, the following order concerning various steps provides a useful procedural guideline regarding the research process. I. Formulating the research problem. E. Extrusive literature survey. E. Developing the hypothesis. I. V. Preparing the research design. V. Determining sample design. V. Collecting the data. V. Execution of the project. V. Analysis of data. X. Hypothesis testing. X. Generalization and interpretation. And sheet preparation of the report or presentation of the results. I.e. Formal write-up of conclusions reached. A brief description of the above stated steps will be helpful. Formulating the research problems. The foremost step in research process is formulation of the problem to be researched. There are two types of research problems, viz., those which relate to states of nature and those which relate to relationships between variables. At the very outset, the researcher must single out the problem he wants to study, i.e., he must decide the general area of interest or aspect of a subject matter that he would like to inquire into. Initially, the problem may be stated in a broad general way and then the ambiguities, if any, relating to the problem be resolved then. The feasibility of particular solution has to be considered before a working formulation of the problem can be set up. The formulation of a general topic into a specific research problem, thus, constitutes the first step of scientific inquiry. Essentially, two steps are involved in formulating the research problem, viz., understanding the problem thoroughly and rephrasing the same into meaningful terms from an analytical point of view. The best way of understanding the problem is to discuss it with one's own colleagues or with those having some expertise in the matter. Often, a problem is put in general terms and it is up to the researcher to narrow it down and phrase the problem in operational terms. In private business units or in governmental organizations, the problem is usually earmarked by the administrative agencies with whom the researcher can discuss as to how the problem originally came out and what considerations are involved in its possible solutions. The researcher must at the same time examine all available literature to get himself acquainted with the selected problem. Key mirror types of literature: conceptual literature concerning the concepts and theories, and the empirical literature consisting of studies made earlier which are similar to the one proposed. The basic outcome of the review will be the knowledge as to what data and other materials are available for operational purposes, which will enable the researcher to specify his own research problem in a meaningful context. After this, the researcher phrases the problem into analytical or operational terms, i.e., to put the problem in as specific terms as possible. This task of formulating or defining a research problem is a step of greatest importance in the entire research process. The problem to be investigated must be defined unambiguously, for that will help discriminating relevant data from irrelevant ones. Care must, however, be taken to verify the objectivity and validity of the background facts concerning the problem. The statement of the objective is of basic importance because it determines the data which is to be collected, the characteristics of the data which is relevant, relations which are to be explored, the choice of techniques to be used in these explorations in the form of the final report. If that are certain pertinent terms, the same should be clearly defined along with the task of formulating the problem. In fact, formulations of the problem often follows a sequential pattern where a number of formulations are set up, each formulation more specific than the preceding one, each one phrased in more analytical terms, and each more realistic in terms of the available data and resources. Literature survey. Once the problem is formulated, a brief summary of it should be written down. At this juncture, the researcher should undertake extensive literature survey connected with the problem. For this purpose, the abstracting indexing journals and published or unpublished bibliographies are the first place to go to. Academic journals, conference proceeding, government reports, etc. must be tapped depending on the nature of the problem. In this process, it should be remembered that one source will lead to another. The earlier studies, if any, which are similar to the study in hand, should be carefully studied. A good library will be of a great help to the researcher at this stage. In this era of internet, it has become quite easy to articles. One can use some search engine, like Google, or especially Google Scholars, to search scholarly articles. Development of hypotheses. After extensive literature survey, researchers should state in clear terms the assumptions leading to the problem under study. It takes the shape of working hypothesis or hypotheses. Working hypothesis is tentative assumption made in order to draw out and test its logical or empirical consequences. Underscores such the manner in which research hypotheses are developed is particularly important since they provide the focal point for research. They also affect the manner in which tests must be conducted in the analysis of data and indirectly the quality of data which is required for the analysis. Hypothesis should be very specific and limited to the piece of research in hand because it has to be tested. The role of the hypothesis is to guide the researcher by delimiting the area of research and to keep him on the right track. It sharpens his thinking and focuses attention on the more important facts of the problem. It also indicates the type of data required and the type of methods of data analysis to be used. How does one go about developing working hypotheses? The answer is by using the following approach. 1. Discussions with colleagues and experts about the problem, its origin and the objectives in seeking a solution. 2. Examination of data records, if available, concerning the problem for possible trends, peculiarities and other clues. 3. Review of similar studies in the area or of the studies on similar problems, and 4. Exploratory external investigation which involves original field interviews on a limited scale with interested parties and individuals with a view to secure insight into the practical aspects of the problem. Thus, working hypotheses arise as a result of priority thinking about the subject, examination of the available data and material including related studies and the council of experts and interested parties. Working hypotheses are more useful when stated in precise, clearly defined terms. It may as well be remembered that occasionally we may encounter a problem where we do not need working hypotheses, especially in the case of exploratory or formulative researches which do not aim at testing the hypothesis. How does a general rule, specification of working hypotheses is another basic step of the research process as many research problems. Preparing research design. The research problem having been formulated in clear terms, the researcher will be required to prepare a research design, i.e., he will have to state the conceptual structure within which research would he conduct. Preparation of such design facilitates research to be as efficient as possible, yielding maximal information. In other words, the function of research design is to provide for the collection of relevant evidence with optimum effort, time and expenditure. But how well these can be achieved depends mainly on the research purpose. Research purposes may be grouped into 4 categories: phys, exploration, description, diagnosis, and experimentation. A flexible research design which provides opportunity for considering many different aspects of a problem is considered appropriate if the purpose happens to be an accurate description of a situation or of an association between variables. The suitable design will be one that minimizes bias and maximizes the reliability of the data collected in analyses. There are several research designs, such as experimental and non-experimental hypothesis testing. Experimental designs can be either informal designs, such as pivot and after without control, after only with control, before and after with control, or formal designs. Simple and complex factorial designs, out of which the researcher must select one for his own project. Factors in research design. There are several types of research designs. HUD, the preparation of any research design, appropriate for a particular research problem, involves usually consideration of the following factors. 1. Means of obtaining the information. 2. Availability and skills of the researcher and his staff, if any. 3. Explanation of the way in which selected means of obtaining information will be organized and the reasoning leading to the selection. 4. Time available for research, and 5. Cost factor relating to research circa, the finance available for the purpose. Determining sample design. All the items under consideration in a field of inquiry constitute a universe, or population. A complete enumeration of all the items in the all populations is known as a census inquiry. It can be presumed that, in such an inquiry when the items are covered, no element of chance is left and highest accuracy is obtained. But in practice this may not be true. Even the slightest element of bias in such an inquiry will get larger and larger as the number of observations increases. Moreover, there is no way of checking the clement of bias or its extent except through a research or use of sample checks. Besides, this type of inquiry involves a great deal of time, money and energy. Not only this, census inquiry is not possible in practice under many circumstances. For instance, blood testing is done only on sample basis. Hence, quite often we select only a few items from the universe for our study purposes. The items selected constitute what is technically called a sample. The researcher must decide the way of selecting a sample or what is popularly known as a sample design. In other words, a sample design is a definite plan determined before any data is actually collected for obtaining a sample from a given population. Thus, the plan to select 12 of a city's 200 drugstores in a certain way constitutes a sample design. Samples can be either probability or non-probability samples. With probability samples, each element has a known probability of being included in the sample. But the non-probability samples do not allow the researcher to determine this probability. Sample design includes determination of sampling techniques such as probability sampling, cluster sampling, stratified sampling, or systematic sampling, etc. Whereas non-probability samples are those based on convenience sampling, judgment sampling, and quota sampling techniques. A brief mention of the important sample designs is as follows. Random sampling techniques. These are sampling techniques where the items are selected on probability theory. Each unit of the population has the opportunity of being selected into the sample. Random sampling techniques include simple random sampling, stratified sampling, systematic sampling, cluster sampling, etc. Simple random sampling. This type of sampling is also known as chance sampling or probability sampling, where each and every item in the population has an equal chance of inclusion in a sample in each one of the possible samples. In case finite universe has the same probability of being selected. For example, if we have to select a sample of 300 items from a universe of 15,000 items, then we can put the names or numbers of all the 15,000 items on slips of paper and conduct a lottery. Using the random number tables is another method of random sampling. To select the sample, each item is assigned a number from I to 15,000. Then, 305-digit random numbers are selected from a table. To do this, we selected some random starting point and then a systematic pattern is used proceeding through the table. We might start in the 4 row, second column and proceed down the column to the bottom of the table and then move to the top of the numbers in the frame. In it is simply best to fit in the next number selected that does fall our case over 15,000 within the relevant range since the numbers were placed in the table in a completely random fashion. The resulting sample is random. This procedure gives each item an equal probability of being selected. In sample is random. This procedure gives each item an equal probability of being selected. In case of infinite population, the selection of each item in a random this procedure gives each item in a random sample is controlled by the same probability and that successive selections are independent of one another. Stratified sampling. The field of inquiry is not homogeneous and contains variety of items. This type of sampling is adopted. In this method, we first divide the population into different subpopulations known as stratum, such that items in each stratum are homogeneous. From each stratum, items are selected by simple random sample method. For example, if you want to study the consumption pattern of people in Kerala, the state of Kerala may be divided into a number of zones. From each zone, a sample may be selected at random. This method has the advantages of simple random sample method. Stratified sampling method reduces time and expense to a greater extent. Systematic sampling. In some instances, the most practical way of sampling is to go select every I-5th name on list, every I-0th house on one side of a street and so on. Sampling of this type is known as systematic sampling. An element of randomness is usually introduced into this kind of sampling by using random numbers to pick up the unit with which to start. This procedure is useful when sampling flame is available in the form of a list. In such a design, the selection process starts by picking some random points in the list and then every nth clement is selected until the desired number is secured. Cluster sampling. In many surveys, there would be no reliable list of the units of the population or it would be very expensive to collect such a list. In such situations, cluster sampling can be adopted. Cluster sampling consists in forming suitable clusters of units and surveying all the units in a sample of cluster selected. Cluster sampling is used in many surveys as it is very convenient and less costly. Tribal survey can be done by cluster sampling technique. Tribes are generally settled in particular areas. Simple random sampling method will fail here. In such surveys, few settlements are selected as clusters and surveying all the units of the selected cluster may be least time consuming and less costly. Multi-stage sampling. It is further development of the principle of cluster sampling. Suppose we want to investigate the working efficiency of nationalized banks in India and we want to take a sample of few banks for this purpose. The first stage is to seek large primary sampling units such as state or a country. Then we may select certain districts and interview all banks in the chosen district. This would represent a two-stage sampling design with the ultimate sampling G units being clusters of district. Ordinarily, multi-stage sampling is applied in big inquiries extending to a considerable large geographical area, say, the entire country. There are two advantages of this sampling design via, it is easier to administer than most single-stage designs and large number of units can be sampled for a given cost. Non-random sampling techniques. Samples may be selected not based on probability, but considering convenience and easiness of selecting sample units. Such non-random sampling techniques include deliberate sampling, judgment sampling, convenience sampling, quota sampling, etc. Deliberate sampling. Deliberate sampling is also known as purposive sampling. When population elements are selected for inclusions in the sample based on the case of access, it can be called convenience sampling. If a researcher is to secure data for, say, gasoline buyers, he may select a fixed number of petrol stations and may conduct interviews at these stations. This would be an example of convenience sample of gasoline buyers. At times such a procedure may give very biased results, particularly when the population is not homogeneous. Judgment sampling. In judgment sampling, the Res. Archer's judgment is used for selecting items which he considers as secure reactions to a new method of teaching. Judgment sampling is used quite frequently in qualitative research where the desire happens to develop hypothesis rather than to larger population. Convenience sampling. The primary consideration in convenience sampling is the convenience of the researcher as to who can provide the best information to achieve the objectives of the study. The researcher only goes to those people who in his opinion are likely to have the required information and be willing to share it. This type of sampling is extremely useful when you want to construct a historical reality, describe a phenomenon or develop some 88 nanograms about which only a little is known. Quota sampling. The main consideration directing quota sampling is the researcher's case of access to the sample population. In addition to convenience, he is guided by some visible characteristic, such as gender or race, of the study population, that is of interest to him. The sample is selected from a location convenient to the researcher, and whenever a person with this visible relevant characteristic is seen, that person is asked to participate in the study. The process continues until the researcher has been able to contact the required number of respondents. Quota. Collecting the data. In dealing with any real-life problem, it is often found that data at hand is inadequate, and hence, it becomes necessary to collect data that is appropriate. There are several ways of collecting the appropriate data which differ considerably in context of cost, time and other resources at the disposal of the researcher. Primary data can be collected either through experiment or through survey. If the researcher conducts an experiment, he observes some quantitative measurements, or the data, with the help of which he examines the truth contained in his hypothesis. But in the case of a survey, data can be collected by any one or more of the following ways. By observation. This method implies the collection of information by way investigators' own observation, without interviewing the respondents. The information obtained relates to what is currently happening and is not complicated by either the past behavior or future intentions or attitudes of respondent. This method is no doubt an expensive method, and the information provided by this method is also very limited. As such, this method is not suitable in inquiries where large samples are concerned. Through personal interview. The investigator follows a rigid procedure and seeks answer to a set of preconceived questions through personal interviews. The method of collecting data is usually earned out in a structured way where output depends upon the ability of the interviewer to a large extent. Through telephone interviews. This method of collecting information involves contacting the respondents on telephone itself. This is not a very widely used method, but it plays an important role in industrial surveys in developed regions, particularly when the survey has to be accomplished in a very limited time. By mailing of questionnaires. The researcher and the respondents do come in contact with each other if this method of survey is adopted. Questionnaires are mailed to the respondent with a request to return after completing the same. It is the most extensively used method in various economic and business surveys. Before applying this method, usually a pilot study for testing is conducted which reveals a weakness. If any 9 of the UCO questionnaire to be used must be prepared very carefully so that it may prove to be effective in collecting the relevant information. Through schedules. Under this method, the enumerators are appointed and given training. They are provided with schedules containing relevant questions. These enumerators go to respondent with these schedules. Data is collected by filling up the schedules by enumerators on the basis of replies given by respondents. Much depend upon the capability of enumerators so far as this method is concerned. Some occasional field checks on the work of the enumerators may ensure sincere work. The researcher selected one of these methods of collecting the data taking into consideration the nature of investigation, objective and scope of the inquiry, financial resources, available time and desired degree of accuracy. Truly should attention to all these factors, but much depends upon the ability and experience of the researcher. In this context, Dr. A.L. Boley very aptly remarks that in collection of statistical data, common sense is the chief requisite and experience of the chief teacher. Analysis of data. After that data has been collected, the researcher turns to the task of analyzing them. The analysis of data requires a number of closely related operations such categories, the application of these categories to raw data through coding, tabulation and then drawing statistical inferences. The UD data should necessarily be conducted a few manageable groups and tables for further analysis. Thus, researchers should classify the raw data into some purposeful and usable categories. Coding is usually done at this stage, through which the categories of data is transformed into symbols that may be tabulated and counted. Editing is the procedure that improves the quality of the data for coding. With coding, the stage is ready for tabulation. Tabulation is a part of technical procedure wherein the classified data is put in the form of tables. The mechanical devices can be made use of at this juncture. A great deal of data, especially in large inquiries, is tabulated by computers. Computers not only save time but also make it possible to study large number of variables affecting a problem simultaneously. Analysis work after tabulation is generally based on the computation of various percentages, coefficients, etc., by applying various well-defined statistical formulae. In the process of analysis, relationships or difference supporting or conflicting with original or new hypothesis should be subjected to tests of significance to determine with what validity data can be said to indicate any conclusions. For instance, if there are samples of weekly wages, each sample being drawn from factories in different parts of the same city, giving 2 different mean values, then our problem may be whether the 2 mean values are significantly different or the difference is just a matter of chance. Through the use of statistical tests we can establish whether such a difference is real one or as the result of random fluctuations. If the difference happens to be real, the inference will be that the 2 samples come from different universes, and if the difference is due to chance, the conclusion would be that the 2 samples belong to the same universe. Similarly, the technique of analysis of variance can help us in analyzing whether 3 or more varieties of seeds grown on certain fields yield significantly different result or not. In brief, the researcher can analyze the collected data with the help of various statistical measures. Hypothesis testing. After analyzing the data as stated above, the researcher is in a position to test the hypothesis, if any, he had formulated earlier. Do the facts support the hypothesis or they happen to be contrary? This is the usual question which should be answered while testing hypothesis. Various tests, such as chi-square test, t-test, f-test, have been developed by statisticians for the purpose. These tests are discussed in detail later in the book. The hypothesis may be tested through the use of one or more of such tests, depending upon the nature and object of research inquiry. Hypothesis to result in either accepting the hypothesis or in rejecting it if the research had no hypothesis to start with. Generalizations established on the basis of data may be stated as hypothesis to be tested by subsequent researches in times to come. Generalization and interpretation. If a hypothesis is tested and upheld several times, it may be possible for the researcher to arrive at generalization, i.e., to build a theory as a matter of fact. The value of research lies in its ability to arrive at certain generalizations. If the researcher had no hypothesis to start with, he might seek to explain his findings on the basis of some theory. It is loosed as interpretation. The process of interpretation may quite often trigger off new question which in turn may lead to further researches. Preparation of the report or the thesis. Finally, the researcher has to prepare the report of what has been done by him. Writing the report must be done with great care, keeping in view the following factors. 1. The layout of the report should be as follows: the preliminary pages, the main text, and the end matter. 2. When on this preliminary pages the report should carry title and date followed by acknowledgments and forward. Then there should be a table of contents followed by a list of tables and list of illustrations, if any, given in the report. 3. The main text of the report should have the following parts. Introduction. It should contain a clear statement of the objective of the research and an explanation of the methodology adopted in accomplishing the research. The scope of the study along with various limitations should as well be stated in this part. Summary of findings. After introduction there would appear a statement of findings and recommendations in non-technical language. If the findings are extensive, they should be summarized. Main report. Then main body of the report should be presented in logical sequence and broken down into readily identifiable sections. Conclusion. Towards the end of the main text, researcher should again put down the results of his research clearly and precisely. In fact, it is the final summing up. At the end of the report, appendices should be enlisted in respect of all technical data. Bibliography, i.e., list of books, journals, reports, etc., consulted, should also be given at the end. Index should also be given specially in a published research report. Reports should be written in a concise and objective style in simple language, avoiding vague expressions such as it seems, there may be, and the like. Charts and illustrations in the main report should be used only if they present the information more clearly and forcibly. Calculated limits must be mentioned, and the various constraints experienced in conducting research operations may as well be stated. Review questions. 1. Explain research process. 2. Give a flowchart of research process. 3. Explain formulation of research problem. 4. What are the steps in formulating research problem? 5. Explain the sources of research problem. 6. What is review of literature? 7. Why literature review is conducted. 8. Explain the term hypothesis. 9. Distinguish between null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. 10. Enlist steps in formulating hypothesis. 11. What is a research design? 12. What is the significance of research design? 13. What is sample design? 14. What factors influence research design? 15. What are the objectives of sample design? 16. Discuss different sampling techniques. Unit 7. Research problem. In research process, the first and foremost step happens to be that of selecting and properly defining a research problem. A researcher must find the problem and formulate it so that it becomes susceptible to research. Like a medical doctor, a researcher must examine all the symptoms presented to him or observed by him concerning a problem before he can diagnose correctly. To define a problem correctly, a researcher must know what a problem is. What is a research problem? Research problem, in general, refers to some difficulty which a researcher experiences in the context of either a theoretical or practical situation and wants to obtain a solution for the same. Usually we say that a research problem does exist in the following conditions are met with. I. There must be an individual or a group or an organization, let us call it, to whom the problem can be attributed. The individual or the organization, as the case may be, occupies an environment, say in which is defined by values of the uncontrolled variables, y. E. There must be at least two courses of action, say C and C, to be pursued. A course of action is defined by one or more values of the controlled variables. For example, the number of items purchased at specified time is said to be one course of action. E. There must be at least two possible outcomes, say 0 and 0, of course of action, of which one should be preferable to the other. In other words, this means that there must be at least one outcome that the researcher wants, i.e., an objective. E. There must be at least two possible outcomes, say 0 and 0, of course of action, of which one should be preferable to the other. In other words, this means that there must be at least one outcome that the researcher wants, i.e., an objective. IV courses of action available must provide some chance of obtaining the objective, but they cannot provide the same chance, otherwise the choice would not matter. Thus, if PO1, CN #P. In simple words, we can say that the choices must have unequal efficiencies for the desired outcomes. Over and above these conditions, the individual or the organization can be said to have the problem only if I does not know what courses of action best, EI, must be in doubt about the solution. Thus, an individual or a group of persons can be said to have a problem which can be technically described as a research problem, if the individual or the group, having one or more desired outcomes, are confronted with two or more courses of action that have some but not equal efficiency for the desired objectives and are in doubt about which course of action is best. We can, thus, state the components of a research problem as under. Essential components of research problem. 1. There must be an individual or a group which has some difficulty or the problem. 2. There must be some objectives to be attained at. If one wants nothing, one cannot have a problem. 3. There must be alternative means of the courses of action for obtaining the objective one wishes to attain. This means that there must be at least two means available to a researcher, for if has not choice of means, he cannot have a problem. 4. There must remain some doubt in the mind of a researcher with regard to the selection of alternatives. This means that research must answer the question concerning the relative efficiency of the possible alternatives. Thus, a research problem is one which requires a researcher to find out the best solution for the given problem, i.e., to find out by which course of action the objective can be attained optimally in the context of a given environment. There are several factors which may result in making the problem complicated. For instance, the environment may change, affecting the efficiencies of the courses of action or the values of the outcomes. The number of alternative courses of action may be very large. Persons not involved in making the decision may be affected by it and react to it favorably or unfavorably, and similar other factors. All such elements, or at least the important ones, may be thought in context of a research problem. Selecting the problem. The research problem undertaken for study must be carefully selected. The task is a difficult one, although it may not appear to be so. Help may be taken from a research guide in this connection. Nevertheless, every researcher must find out his own salvation, for research problems cannot be borrowed. A problem must spring from the researcher's mind like a plant springing from its own seed. If our eyes need glasses, it is not the optician alone who decides about the number of the lens we require. We have to see ourselves and enable him to prescribe for us the right number by coupling with him. Thus, a research guide can at the most only help a researcher choose a subject. However, be observed by a researcher in selecting a research problem or a subject for research. A subject which is overdone should not be normally chosen, for it will be a difficult task to throw any new light in such a case. Controversial subject should not become the choice of an average researcher. Too narrow or too vague problems should be avoided. The subject selected for research should be familiar and feasible so that the related research materials of sources of research are within one's reach. Then it is quite difficult to supply definitive ideas concerning how a researcher should obtain ideas for his research. For this purpose, contact an expert or a professor in the university who is already engaged in research. He may as well read articles published in current literature available on the subject and may think how the techniques and ideas discussed therein might be applied to the solution of other problems. He may discuss with others what he has in mind concerning the problem. In this way he should make all possible efforts in selecting a problem. The importance of the subject, the qualifications and the training of a researcher, the costs involved, the time factor, a few other criteria that must also be considered in selecting a problem. In other words, before the final selection of a problem is done, a researcher must ask himself the following questions. A. Whether he is well equipped in terms of his background to carry out the research. B. Whether the study falls within the budget light can afford. C. Whether necessary cooperation can be obtained from those who must participate in research as subjects. If the answers to all these questions are in the affirmative, one may become sure so far as the practicability of the study is concerned. If the subject for research is selected properly by observing the above-mentioned points, the research will not be a boring drudgery, rather it will be love's labor. In fact, zest for work is a must. The subject or the problem selected must involve the researcher and must have an uppermost place in his mind so that he may undertake all pains needed for the study. Necessity of defining the problem. If the subject for research is selected properly by observing the above If the subject for research is selected properly by observing the above-mentioned points, the research will not be a boring drudgery, rather it will be love's labor. In fact, zest for work is a must. The subject or the problem selected must involve the researcher and must have an uppermost place in his mind so that he may undertake all pains needed for the study. Necessity of defining the problem. Quite often we all hear that a problem clearly stated is a problem half solved. This statement signifies the need for defining a research problem. The problem to be investigated must be defined unambiguously, for that will help to discriminate relevant data from the irrelevant ones. A proper definition of research problem will enable the researcher to be on the track, whereas an ill-defined problem may create hurdles. Questions like, what data is to be collected? What characteristic of data are relevant and need to be studied? What relation is to be explored? What techniques are to be used for the purpose? And similar other questions crop up in the mind of the researcher, who can well plan his strategy and find answers to all such questions only when the research problem has been well defined. Thus, defining a research problem properly is a prerequisite for any study and is a step of the highest importance. In fact, formulation of a problem is often more essential than its solution. It is only on the careful detailing of the research problem that we can work out the research design and can smoothly carry on all the consequential steps involved while doing research. Technique involved in defining a problem. Let us start with the question, what does one mean when she wants to define a researcher problem? The answer may be that one wants to state the problem along with the bounds within which it is to be studied. In other words, defining a problem involves the task of laying down boundaries within which a researcher shall study the problem with a predetermined objective in view. How to define a research problem is undoubtedly a Herculean task. However, it is a task that must be tackled intelligently to avoid the perplexity encountered in a research operation. The usual approach is that the researcher should himself pose the questions, or in case someone else who wants the researcher to carry on research, the concerned individual, organization or authority should pose the question to the researcher, and set up techniques and procedures for throwing light on the question concerned for formulating or defining the research problem, but such an approach generally does not produce definitive results because the question phrased in such a fashion is usually in broad general terms and as such may not be in a form suitable for testing. Defining a research problem properly and clearly is a crucial part of a research study and must in no case be accomplished hurriedly. However, in practice this is frequently overlooked, which causes a lot of problems later on. Hence, the research problem should be defined in a systematic manner, giving due weight to all relating points. The technique for the purpose involves the undertaking of the following steps, generally one after the other. I. Statement of the problem in a general way. E. Understanding the nature of the problem. E. Surveying the available literature. IV. Developing the ideas through discussion. And V. Rephrasing the research problem into a working proposition. A brief description of all these points will be helpful. Statement of the problem in a general way. First of all, the problem should be stated in a broad general way, keeping in view either some practical concern or some scientific or intellectual interest. For this purpose, the researcher must immerse himself thoroughly in the subject matter concerning which he wishes to pose a problem. In case of social research, it is considered advisable to do some field observation, and as such the researcher may undertake some sort of preliminary survey or what is often called pilot survey. The researcher can himself state the problem, or he can seek the guidance of the guide or the subject expert in accomplishing this task. Often, the guide puts forth the problem in general terms, and it is then up to the researcher to narrow it down and phrase the problem in operational terms. In case there is some directive from an organizational authority, the problem then can be stated accordingly. The problem stated in a broad general way may contain various ambiguities which must be resolved by cool thinking and rethinking over the problem. At the same time, the feasibility of a particular solution has to be considered, and the same should be kept in view while stating the problem. Understanding the nature of the problem. The next step in defining the problem is to understand its origin and nature clearly. The best way of understanding the problem is to discuss it with those who first raised it in order to find out how the problem originally came about and with what objectives in view. If the researcher has stated the problem himself, he should consider once again all those points that induced him to make a general statement concerning the problem. For a better understanding of the nature of the problem involved, he can enter into discussion with those who have a good knowledge of the problem concerned or similar other problems. The researcher should also keep in view the environment within which the problem is studied and understood. Surveying the available literature. All available literature concerning the problem at hand must necessarily be surveyed and examined before a definition of the research problem is given. This that the researcher must be well conversant with relevant theories in the field, reports and records, as also all other relevant literature. He must devote sufficient time in reviewing the research already undertaken on related problem. This is done to find out what data and other materials, if any, is available for operational purposes. Knowing what data is available often serves to know the problem itself as well as the technique that might be used. This also helps a researcher to know if there are certain gaps in the theories, or whether the existing theories applicable to the problem under study are inconsistent with each other, or whether the finding of the different studies do not follow a pattern consistent with the theoretical expectations, and so on. All this will enable a researcher to take new strides in the field for furtherance of knowledge, i.e., he can move up starting from the existing premise. Studies on related problems are useful for indicating the type of difficulties that may be encountered in the present study, as also the possible analytical shortcomings. At times such studies may also suggest useful and even new lines of approach to the present problem. Developing the ideas through discussion. Discussion concerning a problem often produces useful information. Various new ideas can be developed through such an exercise. Hence, a researcher must discuss his problem with his colleagues and others who have enough experience in the same area or in working on similar problem. This is quite a lie known as an experience survey. People with experience are in a position to enlighten the researcher on different aspects of his proposed study, and their advice and comments are hugely invaluable to the researcher. They help him sharpen his focus of attention on specific aspects within the field. Discussion with such persons should not only be confined to the formulation of the specific problem at hand, but should also be concerned with the general approach to the given problem, techniques that might be used, possible solutions, etc. Rephrasing the research problem. Finally, the researcher must cite to rephrase the research problem into a working proposition. Once the nature of the problem has been clearly understood, the environment within which the problem has got to be studied has been defined, discussions over the problem have taken place, and the available literature has been surveyed and examined. Rephrasing the problem into analytical or operational terms is not a difficult task. True rephrasing puts the research problem in as specific terms as possible so that it may become operationally viable and may help in the development of working hypotheses. An illustration. The technique of defining a problem outlined above can be illustrated for better understanding by taking an example as under. Let us suppose that a research problem in a broad general way is as follows. Why is productivity in Japan so much higher than in India? In this problem, the question has a number of ambiguities such as what son of productively is being termed to, with what industries the same is related, with what period of time the productively is being talked about. In view of all such ambiguities, a given statement or the question is much too general to be amenable to analysis. Rethinking and discussions allow the problem may result in narrowing down the question. What factor responsible for the higher labor productivity of Japan's manufacturing industries during the decade 1971 to 1980 relative to India's manufacturing industries? This latter version of the problem is definitely an improvement over its earlier version, for the various ambiguities have been removed to the extent possible. Further rethinking and rephrasing might place the problem on a still better operational basis as shown below. To what extent did labor productivity in 1971 to 1980 in Japan exceed that of India in respect of 15 selected manufacturing industries? What factors were responsible for the productivity differentials between the two countries by industries? With this sort of formulation, the various terms involved such as labor productivity differentials, etc. must be explained clearly. The researcher must also cite that the necessary data is available. In case the data for one or more industries selected is not available for the concerning time period, then the said industry or industries will have to be substituted by other industry or industries. The suitability of the time period must also be examined. Thus, all relevant factors must be considered by a researcher before finally defining a research problem. We concluded by saying that the task of defining a research problem, very often, follows a sequential pattern. The problem is stated in a general way. The ambiguities are resolved. Thinking and rethinking process result in more specific formulation of the problem so that it may be a realistic one in terms of the available data and resources and is also analytically meaningful. All this results in a well-defined research problem that is not only meaningful from an operational point of view, but is equally capable of paving the way for the development of working hypotheses and for means of solving the problem itself. Review questions. 1. Describe briefly the techniques of defining a research problem. 2. What is research problem? 3. Define the main issues which should receive the attention of the researcher in formulating the research. 4. How do you define a research problem? 5. Give 3 examples of research H problems. 6. What is the necessity of defining research problem? Explain. 7. Write short notes on experience survey, pilot survey, component of a research problem, rephrasing the research problem. 8. The task of defining the research problem often follows a sequential pattern. Explain. 9. Knowing what data are available often serves to narrow down the problem itself as well as the technique that might be used. Explain the underlying idea in this statement in the context of defining a research problem. 10. Write a comprehensive note on the task of defining a research problem. 11. Specify essential components of a research problem. 12. What are the steps in selecting a research problem? 13. Why literature to be surveyed for problem formulation? 14. What are the qualities of researchable problem? 15. A well-formulated problem is half solved. Explain. Unit 8. Literature review. Introduction. One of the essential preliminary tasks when you undertake a research study is to go through the existing literature in order to acquaint yourself with the available body of knowledge and area of interest. The literature review is an integral part of the entire research process and makes a valuable contribution to almost every operational step. Review of literature. Review of literature refers to the process of scanning past literature, journal articles, earlier researches, and all other published sources, for assessing what has been done so far, on the topic or related topic. It has value even before the first step, that is, when you are merely thinking about a research question that you may want to find answers to through your research journey. In the initial stages of research, it helps you to establish the theoretical roots of your study, clarify your ideas and develop your methodology, but later on the literature review serves to enhance and consolidate your knowledge base and helps you to integrate your finding with the existing body of knowledge. Since an important responsibility in research is to compare your findings with those of others, is it here that the literature review plays an extremely important role. During the write-up of your report, it helps you to integrate your findings with existing knowledge, that is, to either support or contradict earlier research. The higher the academic level of your research, the higher the academic level of your research, the more important the through integration of your findings with exiting literature becomes. Significance of literature review in research. Reviewing literature can be time-consuming, daunting, and frustrating, but it is also rewarding. A literature review has a number of functions. 1. It provides a theoretical background to your study. The literature review involves a paradox. On the one hand, you can't effectively undertake a literature search without sonic idea of the problem you wish to investigate. On the other hand, the literature review can play an extremely important role in shaping your research problem because the process of reviewing the literature helps you to understand the subject area better and thus helps you to understand the relationship between your research problem and the body of knowledge in the area. 2. It improves your methodology. It reviews the means by which you establish the links between what you're proposing to examine and what has already been studied. In other words, it helps you to refine your research methodology. Going through the literature acquaints you with the methodologies that have been used by others to find answers to research questions similar to the one you are investigating. A literature review tells you if others have used procedures and methods similar to the ones that you are proposing, which procedures and methods have worked well for them, and what problem they have faced with them. By becoming aware of any problems and pitfalls, you will be better positioned to select a methodology that is capable of providing valid answers to your research questions. This will increase your confidence in the methodology you plan to use and will equip you to defend its use. 3. It contributes to stock of knowledge. Through the literature review, you are able to show how your findings have contributed to the existing body of knowledge in your profession. By conducting research, it is expected to acquire new knowledge or modify existing knowledge. It is through literature review that one can assess what is current knowledge and what is lacking. 4. It enables you to contextualize your findings. Obtaining answers to your research questions is comparatively easy. The difficult part is examining how your practical findings fit into the existing theory and concepts. How do answers to your research questions compare with what others have found? How are your findings different from those of others? For you to be able to answer these questions, you need to go back to your literature review. It is important to place your findings in the context of what is already known in your field of inquiry. 5. It broadens your knowledge base in your research area. The most important function of the literature review is to ensure you read widely around the subject area in which you intend to conduct your research study. It is important that you know what other researchers have found in regard to the same or similar questions, what theories have been put forward and what gaps exist in the relevant body of knowledge. When you undertake a research project for a higher degree, that is, an MA or a PhD, you are expected to be an expert in your area of study. A thorough literature review helps to ensure that you fulfill this expectation. Another important reason for doing a literature review is that it helps you to understand how the findings of your study led into the existing body of knowledge. Martin 1985, 30. 6. It enhances clarity and focus. It also helps you to bring clarity and focus to your research problem. It improves your methodology, broaden your knowledge base in your research area and bring proper direction to research. It helps you to understand new relationships between your research problem and the body of knowledge in the area. Procedure for reviewing the literature. If you do not have a specific research problem, you should review the literature in your broad area of interest with the aim of gradually narrowing down to what you want to find out about. After that, the literature review should be focused around your research problem. There is a danger in reviewing the literature without having a reasonably specific study and the idea of what you want to study. It can condition your thinking about your methodology you might use, resulting in a less innovative choke of research problem and methodology than otherwise would have been the case. Hence, you should try to conceptualize your research problem before undertaking your major literature review. Steps in review of literature. There are 4 steps involved in conducting a literature review. Search for existing literature in your area of study, review the literature selected, develop a theoretical framework and develop a conceptual framework. The skills required for these tasks are different. Developing theoretical and conceptual frameworks are more difficult than the other tasks. Search for existing literature. To effectively search for literature in your field of inquiry, it is imperative that you have in mind at least some idea of the broad subject area and of the problem you wish to investigate, in order to set parameters for your search. Next, compile a bibliography for this broad area. There are 2 sources that you can use to prepare a bibliography: books and journals. The best way to search for a book is to look at your library catalogs. When librarians catalog a book, they also assign to it subject headings that usually are based on Library of Congress subject heading. If you are not sure, ask your librarian to help you define the best subject heading for your area. This can save you a lot of time. Publications such as Book Review Index can help you to locate. Search for existing literature. To effectively search for literature in your field of inquiry, it is imperative that you have in mind at least some idea of the broad subject area and of the problem you wish to investigate, in order to set parameters for your search. Next, compile a bibliography for this broad area. There are 2 sources that you can use to prepare a bibliography: books and journals. The best way to search for a book is to look at your library catalogs. When librarians catalog a book, they also assign to it subject headings that usually are based on Library of Congress subject heading. If you are not sure, ask your librarian to help you define the best subject heading for your area. This can save you a lot of time. Publications such as Book Review Index can help you to locate books of interest. There are several sources designed to make your search for journals easier, and these can save you enormous time. They are: 1. Indices of journals, e.g. Humanities Index. 2. Abstract of articles, e.g. ERIC. 3. Citation indices, c.g. Social Sciences Citation Index. All the above indexing, abstracting and citation services are available in print or on CD-ROM, or are stored on a mainframe computer accessible through the internet, a worldwide electronic communication system. In most libraries, information on books, journals, abstracts and so on is stored on computers and CD-ROM. In each case, the information is classified by subject, author and title. You may also have the keywords option: author keyword, title keyword, expert keyword, or just keywords. What system you use depends upon what is available in your library and what you are familiar with. There are specially prepared electronic databases in a number of disciplines. These can also be helpful in preparing a bibliography. For example, most libraries carry the electronic databases shown in table. Books. Books, though a central part of any bibliography, have their advantages as well as disadvantages. The main advantage is that the material published in books is usually important and of good quality, and the findings are integrated with other research to form a coherent body of knowledge. Martin 1985, 3.3. The main disadvantage is that the material is not completely up to date, as it can take a few years between the completion of a work and its publication in the form of a book. The best way to identify books is to use a computer catalog. Use the subject catalog or keywords option to search for book in your area of interest. Narrow the subject area search by selecting the appropriate keywords. Look through these titles carefully and identify the books you think are likely to be of interest to you. If you think the titles seem appropriate to your topic, print them down on a piece of paper. Be aware that sometimes the title does not provide enough information to decide if a book is going to be of use. To make this decision, you may have to search for such books in the library and examine their contents. When you have selected 10 to 15 books that you think are appropriate for your topic, examine the bibliography of each. It will save time to photocopy their bibliographies. Go through these bibliographies carefully to identify the books common to several of them. If a book has been referenced by a number of authors, you should include it in your reading list. Prepare a final list of books that you consider essential reading. Having prepared your reading list, locate these books in your library or borrow them from other sources. Examine their contents to double-check that they really are relevant to your topic. If you find that a book is not relevant to your research, delete it from your reading list. If you find that something in a book's contents is relevant to your topic, make an annotated bibliography. An annotated bibliography contains a brief abstract of the aspects covered in a book and your own notes of its relevance. Be careful to keep track of your references. To do this, you can prepare your own card index or use a computer program such as EndNotes of Pro, Cite. Journals. In the same way, you need to go to journals in your research area. Journals provide you with the most up-to-date information, even though there's often a gap of 2 to 3 years between the completion of a research project and its publication in a journal. You should select as many journals as you possibly can, though the number of journals available depend upon the field of study. Certain fields have more journals than others. As with books, you need to prepare a list of the journals you want to examine for identifying literature relevant to your study. This can be done in a number of ways. You can 1. Locate the barred copies of the journals that are appropriate to your study. 2. Look at citation of abstract indices to identify and or read the abstract of such articles. 3. Use the internet. Whichever method you choose, first identify the journals that you want to look at in more details for your review of the literature. The next step is to make preparations to go through them. If you have been able to identify any useful journals and articles, prepare a list of those you want to examine, by journal. Select one of these journals and, starting with the latest issue, examine its contents page to see if there is an article of relevance to your research topic. If you feel that a particular article is of interest to you, read its abstract. If you think you are likely to use it, depending upon your financial resources, either photocopy it, prepare a summary and record its reference for later use. Review the literature selected. Now that you have identified several books and is useful, the next step is to start reading them critically to pull together themes and issues that are associated. If you do not have theoretical framework of themes in mind to start with, use separate sheets of paper for each article or book. Once you develop a rough framework, using a separate sheet of paper for each theme of that framework. As you read further, go on slotting the information where it logically belongs under the themes so far developed. You may need to add more themes as you go. In doing so, read critically with particular reference to the following aspects. 1. Note whether the knowledge relevant to your theoretical framework has been confirmed beyond doubt. 2. Note the theories put forward, the criticism of these and their basis, the methodologies adopted, study design, sample size and its characteristics, measurement procedures, etc., and the criticism of them. 3. Examine to what extent the findings can be generalized to other situations researcher and give you opinion about the validity of these differences. 4. Ascertain the areas in which little or nothing is known, the gaps that exist in the body of knowledge. Develop a theoretical frame. Examining the literature can be a never-ending task, but as you have limited time, it is important to set parameters by reviewing the literature in relation to some main themes pertinent to your research topic. The literature can be a never-ending task, but as you have limited time, it is important to set parameters by reviewing the literature in relation to some main themes pertinent to your research topic. As you start reading the literature, you will soon discover that the problem you wish to investigate has its roots in a number of theories that have been developed from different perspectives. The information obtained from different books and journals now needs to sort it under the main themes and theories, highlighting agreements and disagreements among the authors and identifying the unanswered questions or gaps. You will also realize that the literature deals with a number of aspects that have a direct or indirect bearing on your research topic. Use these aspects as a basis for developing your theoretical framework. Unless you review the literature in relation to this framework, you will not be able to develop a focus in your literature search. That is, your theoretical framework provides you with a guide as you read. This brings us to the paradox mentioned previously. Until you go through the literature, you cannot develop a theoretical framework, and until you have developed a theoretical framework, you cannot effectively review the literature. The solution is to read some of the literature, then attempt to develop a framework, even a loose one. Within you can organize the rest of the literature you read. As you read more about the area, you are likely to change the framework. However, this brings us to the paradox mentioned previously. Until you go through the literature, you cannot develop a theoretical framework, and until you have developed a theoretical framework, you cannot effectively review the literature. The solution is to read some of the literature, then attempt to develop a framework, even a loose one. Within you can organize the rest of the literature you read. As you read more about the area, you are likely to change the framework. However, without it, you will get bogged down in a great deal of unnecessary reading and note-taking that may not be relevant to your study. Literature pertinent to your study may deal with two types of information. 1. Universal global trends. 2. Specific local trends or a specific program. In writing about such information, you should start with the general information, gradually narrowing it down to the specific. Look at the example in Figure 3.1. Figure 3.1, developing a theoretical framework, the relationship between mortality and fertility. If you want to study the relationship between mortality and fertility, you should review literature about fertility, trends, theories, some of the indices and critiques of them, factors affecting fertility, method of controlling fertility, factors affecting acceptance of contraceptive, and so on. Mortality, factors affecting mortality, mortality indices and their sensitivity in measuring change in mortality levels of a population, trends as mortality, and so on, and, most importantly, the relationship between fertility and mortality, theories that have been put forward to explain the relationship and implications of the relationship. Out of this literature review, you need to develop a theoretical framework for your study. Primarily, this should revolve around theories that have been put forward about the relationship. For example, it has been explained from economic, religious, medical, and psychological perspectives. Within each perspective, several theories have been put forward: insurance theory, fear of none, survival, replacement theory, utility theory, extra, or, hoarding theory, and risk theory. Your literature review should be written under the following headings, with most of the review involving the examination of the relationship between fertility and mortality. Fertility theories. 1. The theory of demographic transition. 2. Trends in fertility global, and then narrow it to national and local levels. 3. Methods of contraception, their acceptance and effectiveness. 4. Factors affecting mortality. 5. Trends in mortality and their implications. 6. Measurements of mortality indices and their sensitivity. 7. Relationship between fertility and mortality, different theories such as insurance, fear and non-survival, price, utility, risk. Develop a conceptual framework. The conceptual framework stems from the theoretical framework and concentrates, usually, on one section of that theoretical framework which becomes the basis of your study. The latter consists of the theories or issue in which your study is embedded, whereas the former describes the aspects your selected framework to become the basis of your inquiry. The conceptual framework is the basis of your research problem. For instance, in the example cited in Figure 3.1, the theoretical framework includes all the theories that have been put forward to explain the relationship between fertility and mortality. However, out of these, you may be planning to test only one, say, the fear and non-survival. Hence, the conceptual framework grows out of the theoretical framework and relates to the specific research problem concerning the fear of the non-survival theory. Writing up the literature reviewed. Now all that remains to be done is to write about the literature you have reviewed. As mentioned in the beginning of this chapter, the broad two functions of a literature review area. 1. To provide a theoretical background to your study, and 2. To enable you to contextualize your findings in relation to the existing body of knowledge in addition to refining your methodology. The content of your literature review reflects these two purposes. In order to fulfill the first purpose, you identify and describe various theories relevant to your field, and specify gaps in existing knowledge in the area, recent advances in the area of study, current trends and so on. In order to comply with the second function, you integrate your results with specific and relevant findings from the existing literature by comparing the two for confirmation or contradiction. While reading the literature for theoretical background of your study, you will realize that certain themes have emerged. List the main ones, converting them into subheadings. These subheadings should be precise, descriptive of the theme in question, and follow a logical progression. Now, under each subheading, record the main findings with respect to that same in question, highlighting the reasons for and against an argument if they exist, and identifying gaps and issues. Some people write up the entire literature review without subheadings. The author strongly suggests that you write your literature review under subheadings. The second broad function 2. To enable you to contextualize your findings in relation to the existing body of knowledge in addition to refining your methodology. The content of your literature review reflects these 2 purposes. Writing up the literature reviewed. Now all that remains to be done is to write about the literature you have reviewed. As mentioned in the beginning of this chapter, the broad 2 functions of a literature review area. 1. To provide a theoretical background to your study, and 2. To enable you to contextualize your findings in relation to the existing body of knowledge in addition to refining your methodology. The content of your literature review reflects these 2 purposes. In order to fulfill the first purpose, you identify and describe various theories relevant to your field, and specify gaps in existing knowledge in the area, recent advances in the area of study, current trends and so on. In order to comply with the second function, you integrate your results with specific and relevant findings from the existing literature by comparing the 2 for confirmation or contradiction. While reading the literature for theoretical background of your study, you will realize that certain themes have emerged. List the main ones, converting them into subheadings. These subheadings should be precise, descriptive of the theme in question, and follow a logical progression. Now, under each subheading, record the main findings with respect to that same in question, highlighting the reasons for and against an argument if they exist, and identifying gaps and issues. Some people write up the entire literature review without subheadings. The author strongly suggests that you write your literature review under subheadings. The second broad function of the literature review, contextualizing the findings of your study, requires you to very systematically compare your findings with those made by others. Quote from these studies to show how your findings contradict, confirm or add to them. If places your findings in the context of what others have found out. This function is undertaken when writing about your findings, that is after analysis of your data. Almost every great step in the history of science has been made by the anticipation of nature, that is, by the invention of hypotheses which, though verifiable, often had very little foundation to start with. Review questions. 1. What is meant by review of literature? 2. What is the purpose of literature review? 3. State the significance of review of literature. 4. Enlist the procedure in literature review. 5. How does literature review broaden your knowledge? 6. How does literature review improve research methodology? 7. What is the need for literature review? 8. Is internet helpful in literature review? 9. What are the aspects to be noted in literature survey? 10. What is the role of journal in literature review? 11. State the procedure in writing the literature review. 12. How does literature review brings clarity and focus to research? Unit 9. Development of hypothesis. Introduction. The second important consideration in the formulation of a research problem is the construction of hypotheses. Hypotheses bring clarity, specificity and focus to a research problem, but are not essential for a study. You can conduct a valid investigation without constructing a single format hypothesis. On the other hand, within the context of a research study, you can construct as many hypotheses as you consider to be appropriate. Some believe that one must formulate a hypothesis to undertake an investigation. Hypotheses primarily arise from a set of hunches or assumptions that are tested through a study, and one can conduct a perfectly valid study without having these hunches or speculations. However, in epidemiological studies, to narrow the field of investigation, it is important to formulate hypotheses. Importance of hypothesis. The importance of hypotheses lies in their ability to bring direction, specificity and focus to a research study. They tell a researcher what specific information to collect, and thereby provide greater focus. Let us imagine you are at the races and you place a bet. You bet on a hunch at a particular horse will wire. You will only know if your hunch was right after the race. Take another example. Suppose you have a hunch that there are more smokers than non-smokers in your class. To test your hunch, you ask either all or just some of the class if they are smokers. You can then conclude whether your hunch was right or wrong. Now let us take a slightly different example. Suppose you work in the area of public health. Your clinical impression is that a higher rate of a particular condition prevails among people coming from a specific population subgroup. You want to find out the probable cause of this condition. There would be many causes. To explore every conceivable possibility would require an enormous amount of time and resources. Hence, to narrow the choice based on your knowledge of the field, you could identify what you assume to be the most probable cause. You could then design a study to collect the information needed to verify your hunch. If on verification you were able to conclude that the assumed cause was the real cause of the condition, your assumption would have been right. In these examples, you started with a superficial hunch or assumptions. In one case, horse racing, you waited for the event to take place. In the other 2 instances you waited for the event to take place, and in the other 2 instances you designed a study to assess the validity of your assumption, and only after careful investigation did you reach a conclusion about the validity of your assumptions. Hypotheses are based upon similar logic. As a researcher, you did not know about a phenomenon, a situation, the prevalence of a condition in a population, or about the outcome of a program, but you do have a hunch to form the basis of a certain assumptions or guesses. You test these by collecting information that will enable you to conclude if your hunch was right. The verification process can have one of the 3 outcomes. Your hunch may prove to be right, partially right, or wrong. Without this process of verification, you cannot conclude anything about the validity of your assumption. Definition of hypothesis. Hence, a hypothesis is a hunch, assumption, suspicion, assertion or an idea about a phenomenon, relationship or situation, the reality or truth of which you do not know. A researcher calls these assumptions, assertion, statement or hunches hypotheses, and they become the basis of inquiry. In most studies, a hypothesis will be based upon either previous studies or on your own or someone else's observation. There are many definitions of hypothesis. According to Kurlinger, a hypothesis is a conjectural statement of the relationship between 2 or more variables. Webster's New International Dictionary of English Language defines a hypothesis as proposition, condition, or principle which is assumed, perhaps without belief, in order to draw out its logical consequences and by this method to test it accord with facts which are known or may be determined. Black and Champion define a hypothesis as a tentative statement about something the validity of which is usually unknown. In another definition, Bailey defines a hypothesis as a proposition that is stated in a testable form and that predicts a particular relationship between 2 or more variables. In other words, if we think that a relationship exists between 2 or more variables to be studies, we first state it as a hypothesis and then test the hypothesis in the field. 1978, 35. According to Grinnell and Stothers, a hypothesis is written in such a way that it can be proven or disproven by valid and reliable data. It is in order to obtain these data that we perform our study. From the above definitions, it is apparent that a hypothesis has certain characteristics. 1. It is a tentative proposition. 2. Its validity is unknown. 3. In most cases, it specifies a relationship between 2 or more variables. Functions of hypothesis. While some researchers believe that to conduct a study requires a hypothesis, having a hypothesis is not essential as already mentioned. However, a hypothesis is important in terms of bringing clarity to the research problem. Specifically, a hypothesis serves the following functions. 1. Focus. The formulation of a hypothesis provides a study with focus. It tells you what specific aspects of a research problem to investigate. 2. Discretion. A hypothesis tells you what data to collect and what not to collect, thereby providing discretion to the study. 3. Objectivity. It provides a direction and objective for the study. The construction of a hypothesis enhances objectivity in a study. 4. A hypothesis may enable you to set to the formulation of theory. It enables you to specifically conclude what is true or what is false. Characteristic of hypothesis. There are a number of considerations to keep in mind when constructing a hypothesis, as they are important for valid verification. 1. A hypothesis should be simple, specific and conceptually clear. There are no place for ambiguity in the construction of a hypothesis, as ambiguity will make the verification of your hypothesis almost impossible. It should be one-dimensional, that is, it should rest only one relationship or hunch at a time. To be able to develop a good hypothesis, you must be familiar with the subject area. The literature review is of immense help. The more insight you have into a problem, the easier it is to construct a hypothesis. For example, the average age of the male students in a class is higher than that of the female students. The above hypothesis is clear, specific and easy to test. It tells you what you are attempting to compare: average age of this class, which population groups are being compared, female and male students. What you want to establish: higher average age of the male students, etc. Let us take another example. Suicide rates vary inversely with social cohesion. This hypothesis is clear and specific, but a lot more difficult to test. There are three aspects of this hypothesis: suicide rates, vary inversely, which stipulates the direction of the relationship, and social cohesion. To find out the suicide rates and to establish a relationship is inverse or otherwise are comparatively easy, but to ascertain social cohesion is a lot more difficult. What determines social cohesion? How can it be measured? This. 2. A hypothesis should be capable of verification. Methods and techniques must be available for data collection and analysis. There is no point in formulating a hypothesis if it cannot be subjected to verification because there are no techniques to verify it. However, this does not necessarily mean that you should not formulate a hypothesis for which there are no methods of verification. You might, in the process of doing your research, develop new techniques to verify it. 3. A hypothesis should be related to the existing body of knowledge. It is important that your hypothesis emerges from the existing body of knowledge, and that it adds to it, as is an important function of research. This can only be achieved if the hypothesis has its roots in the existing body of knowledge. 4. A hypothesis should be operationalizable. This means that it can be expressed in terms that can be measured. If it cannot be measured, it cannot be tested and, hence no conclusion can be drawn. It should be practicable, valid and stable. Types of hypothesis. As explained, any assumption that you seek to validate through an inquiry is called a hypothesis. Hence, theoretically there should be only one type of hypothesis, that is, the research hypothesis, the basis of investigation. However, because of the convention in scientific inquiries and because of the wording used in the construction of a hypothesis, hypotheses can be classified into several types. Broadly, there are two categories of hypothesis. 1. Research hypothesis. Ordinarily, a hypothesis is simply an assumption to be proved, but for a research hypothesis is a formal question that he intends to resolve. Quite often a research hypothesis is a predictive statement, capable of being tested by scientific methods. These are hypotheses which can be objectively and statistically verified and tested. Generally, research hypotheses are accepted when proved right. 2. Alternate hypothesis. The formulation of an alternate hypothesis is a convention in scientific circles. Its main function is to explicitly specify the relationship that will be considered as true in case the research hypothesis proves to be wrong. In a way, an alternate hypothesis is the opposite of the research hypothesis. Again, conventionally, a null hypothesis, or hypothesis of no difference, is formulated as an alternate hypothesis. Let us take an example. Suppose you want to test the effect of different combinations of maternal and child health services (MCH) and nutrition supplements (NS) have on the infant mortality rate. To test this, an alternate hypothesis may be formed as lack of nutrition leads to higher infant mortality rate. Formulating working hypothesis. Working hypothesis means hypothesis formulated for specific testing and study, as a part of the research process. Such working hypothesis may be null hypothesis, hypothesis of difference, hypothesis of point prevalence, or hypothesis of association. There are several ways of formulating practical hypotheses. For example, 1. There will be no difference in the level of infant mortality among the different treatment modalities. 2. The MCH and NS treatment group will register a greater decline in infant mortality than the MCH. The NS treatment or the control group. 3. Infant mortality in the MCH treatment group will reach a level of 31 thousandths over 5 years. 4. Decline in the infant mortality rate will be 3 times greater in the MCH treatment group and the NS1 over 5 years. Let us take another example. Suppose you want to study the smoking pattern in a community in relation to gender differentials. The following hypothesis could be constructed. 1. There is no significant difference in the proportion of male and female smokers in the study population. 2. A greater proportion of females and males are smokers in the study population. 3. A total of 60% of female and males are smokers in the study population. 4. There are twice as many female smokers and male smokers in the study population. In both sets of example, the way the first hypothesis has been formulated indicates that there is no difference either in the extent of the impact of different treatment modalities on the infant mortality rate or in the proportion of male and female smokers. When you construct a hypothesis stipulating that there is no difference between two situations, groups, outcomes, or the prevalence of a condition or phenomenon, this is called a null hypothesis and is usually written as HO. The second hypothesis in each example implies that there is a difference either in the extent of the impact of different treatment modalities on infant mortality or in the proportion of male and female smokers among the population, though the extent of the difference is not specified. A hypothesis which specifies its magnitude is called a hypothesis of difference. A researcher may have enough knowledge about the smoking behavior of the community or the treatment program and its likely outcomes to speculate almost the exact prevalence of a situation or the outcomes of a treatment program in quantitative units. Examine the third hypothesis in both sets of examples. The level infant mortality is 31 thousandths and the proportion of female and male smokers is 60 and 30% respectively. This type of hypothesis is known as hypothesis of point prevalence. The fourth hypothesis in both sets of examples speculate a relationship between the impact of different combinations of MCH and NS program on the dependent variable, infant mortality, or the relationship between the relevance of a phenomenon, smoking, among different population, male and female. This type of hypothesis stipulates the extent of the relationship in terms of the effect of different treatment groups on the dependent variable, 3 times greater in the